So Jim, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, let me make it so you can share your screen. There we go. All right.
Okay.
I think we're ready.
All
Take
right.
it away.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for all coming to the workshop today. So I'm Jim Perchcante, and I've only been imaging for a couple years. I started after the lunar eclipse in January of 19. So about 2 years ago this week, the bug got me, and I decided I wanted to get into imaging. At the time, I wasn't a member of the Raleigh Astronomy Club. I only vaguely knew about the club. I'd been to one meeting maybe a decade ago. I certainly didn't know there were a group of imagers in town that were doing things that I couldn't even imagine at the time. But I knew I wanted to start doing imaging. And so I started watching YouTube videos and going on cloudy nights. And in about a month's time, I made some purchases and started imaging. And so let's figure out which way to roll here. So behind me, you can see the rig that I put together at the time. And so my goal today is to kind of go through, here's everything that I wish I knew 2 years ago. And so if you're just starting off and don't know where to go or how to compare one mount against another or one scope against another or what camera to get, my goal is to kind of give an overview of sort of here's what the different features mean. And here are things to look for and things to avoid. Just kind of give you sort of what I wish I had. And then we've got a lot of people here who have been doing this a lot longer than me who can give you some more expert level advice. I'm going to start sharing and start my presentation. Try this one. Okay. All right. So hopefully y'all can see that. So.
Yes.
Okay. And so before I get into a deep sky rig, I just wanted to mention this little device here. This is what I had in January of 2019. I'd gotten this for Christmas, and what it is, it's a cell phone holder. So you can slide your cell phone into this little device. And then it has 3 axes, and you can line up your cell phone camera with your telescope. So some people, when they're getting into imaging, just want to be able to take a picture of what they see in the telescope. And if you've ever tried to hold your cell phone up and do it, to get your cell phone perfectly aligned up perpendicular with that thin beam of light coming out of the telescope, that's pretty tricky. But this device makes it pretty easy. And so I got one of these, I used it that night, and that's when I got hooked. And so the good news is this device is only $65. The bad news is that if you catch the bug, it's going to run you a lot more after that once you start buying all the other equipment you need. The other thing about this device is I still use it. So what it's really good for is like when we had the conjunction a month ago, some of my friends and family were interested in it. I could go outside with my reflector telescope, hook up my cell phone, and I could live stream it. And back before the pandemic, it was great for sidewalk viewing, where I could just set up my telescope and people wouldn't have to look through the eyepiece. I could just look at the phone and see that everything was still viewable, and they could just kind of crowd around and look at the phone. So it's a kind of neat little device. And if you're looking just to see if this is the thing for you, you can get in for $65 if you already have a cell phone and a telescope. And this is just some sample images. And so I got a picture of the eclipse that was when my son was holding it. That's back before I had the thing. He could hold the cell phone. I wasn't able to do that, but he could hold the cell phone just right so he could capture a picture. And you have a lunar eclipse picture, a moon picture, and on the right there, that's actually the Mercury transit. And there aren't a lot of Mercury transit pictures you can take with your cell phone, but with this device, you can. All right, but now let's get into what we really want to was deep sky imaging. And so I want to start with the star trackers because they're a little bit lower in price, and they're really pretty amazing what you can do with them. When I put my rig together and I'd spent several $1,000s building all that, about a month later, my wife told me that she was going out to New Mexico on a business trip for a week, and would I like to go? I'm like, ooh, they got some dark skies up in New Mexico, I'd love to go. The problem is there's no way to get my imaging rig, which weighs about 100 pounds, up to New Mexico. So I immediately had to spend another $500 to get something portable. And that's this star tracker. And so I'll talk a little bit about these. So they're lightweight, they're portable. You can get in for under $1,000. You do have to supply a tripod. It needs to be a sturdy one as well. But I still kind of think of my tracker as sort of more like a toy. It's not really my main device. But when I think about my favorite pictures I've taken, it's all with that the star tracker. It's not with my more expensive mount. And so all these were taken in dark sky locations using the star tracker and just a DSLR with a camera lens. And there's another one that I took that is just a panorama of the night sky in Texas, which goes from one horizon to the other. And I just stacked images and did 3 different sets with a wide frame and then lined them all up. But it's not something I can do with my larger mount. So these are pretty versatile instruments. There's a lot of them. I have no intention of trying to cover all the different star trackers. I just want to kind of give you an overview of what you get in different price ranges. I'm trying to stay with some of the more popular ones that I see out there. I'm sure some of you have used some other ones. They could probably give some advice on some of those. Just kind of putting it together in a chart just so you can kind of see what you get for your price range. This Omegon mini track is this guy over here. And it's sort of on the low end. The first thing you have to think about is payload capacity and how much weight you can put on them. And as you'll find as we get into all these mounts, you don't want to be bumping up against the limit. The closer you get to the limit, the more frustration you're going to get getting your images to come out right. I think the general rule of thumb is try to stay about half the weight limit. And you'll see that as you go up in price, you get more of a payload capacity. So starting off with this Omegon mini track, you can get 4 pounds on there. It doesn't have a motor drive. It's got a wind-up drive, sort of like a clock. And the goal with all of these, I can go back again. You line them up with the North Star so that they're lined up with the Earth's axis, and then they spin around at the sidereal rate, which is just under 24 hours a day. So they're moving at the same rate as the night sky. So you can then aim your camera at what you want to take a picture of. It'll rotate along with the night sky, and you can take some long exposures. So with the mini track, it's got a wind-up drive, like I said. You can get about 60 minutes out of one wind-up, then you're going to wind it up again. It only has 1 tracking speed, and we'll get into why you would want more than 1 tracking speed, even though the night sky only moves at 1 speed. You have to line it up with Polaris using probably a panhead mount on your tripod. So you have to have an extra thing so that you can get the right lineup with Polaris. It doesn't have any additional guiding, so you're going to be doing mostly sort of wide angle, shorter exposures on this, but you probably could still get a few minutes worth of exposure before you start to get too long star trails if you get lined up well. Lining it up is tricky because all it has is basically a straw that you look through and you try to get the North Star lined up through that straw. It's going to be so polar alignment. It's not going to be exactly lined up. So again, you can't do real long exposures or real long zooms with it. And it doesn't have camera control. For most of these, you don't really need camera control. What you need is an intervalometer like this. So you have an intervalometer, and that can be your camera control. As you go up, you get into the sky tracker, which gets your capacity up. You now go to a lithium-ion battery, which is rechargeable. You can get up to 24 hours, which is more than you're going to need. It now has 4 tracking speeds. Why the different tracking speeds? Well, the stars move at 1 speed. But the night sky rotates 1 degree every night because you're also moving around the sun. So the sun moves at a slightly slower speed. So you have a different tracking speed if you're doing some solar photography using it. The moon is moving around the Earth, so then you have a different speed for tracking the moon. So there's a 3rd speed for that. And then the 4th speed is half the sidereal rate. And the idea is that you can then take some longish exposures of the night sky and still have a foreground without blurring it as much. In reality, what you're going to want to do is use the regular speed and then take a still photo of your foreground object and then layer them in Photoshop. But that's why they have the different speeds. It does have a base that it comes with. This is the base. I actually upgraded mine. So you can get some upgrades for it. I got a Williams Optics base, which is a little sturdier and allows you to get a little bit better alignment. It's just a little bit better fine control. It doesn't wiggle around as much, so a little bit better imaging with that. The Sky Tracker does not have guiding, but as you move up to the Sky Guider Pro, which is about twice as much, you get guiding as the big addition, along with a bigger payload capacity. And it does have an illuminated scope, allowing you to get precise alignment with Polaris. And with the Sky Guider Pro, you can then spend some extra money, get an optional hand controller, get an extra cable to attach it to your camera, and you could then, in theory, run the Sky Guider and run your camera with a hand controller. I'm not sure why anybody would want to do that. I would just buy an intervalometer, which you can get for $25. And then you don't really have to do a whole lot in terms of running the guider. Once it starts rotating, there isn't a lot more to do with it. So I wouldn't go that route. I would just get an intervalometer.
Jim?
Yeah.
Quick question. Do any of these, I didn't see it on here, do any of these do go-to?
They do not. So as you move up to more expensive, at least of the ones that I covered, I think there are some that you could put together. I know Skywatcher's got one that I think you can do some go-to with. But of these more popular ones that are just sky trackers, you've got to hunt around and find your object with a camera lens, which can be tricky.
Okay, thank you.
And then on the far right, and again, I didn't have this information when I was buying, the Skywatcher Star Adventure 2i Pro is probably the one that I would get if I had known all of this at the time. It's got a capacity that's right up there with the Sky Guider Pro. It's a little bit less in price. Instead of a rechargeable lithium-ion batteries, it takes 4 AA's, but you can also run it off a USB off your laptop battery if you wanted to do that. Off the 4 AA's, it'll run for 72 hours, so you could take it out on a camping trip and you'd be set with a set of 4 AA's. It has some additional tracking speeds, and what those are really used for is for time-lapse photography, where you can pan across the night sky. It'll move a little bit. It'll take a pic. It'll hold still, take a picture of the night sky. And so you could make some nice sort of panning images of the night sky with those additional speeds. It again has the alt as base. And it does have guiding. It has a polar scope, but you've got to attach it separately, and you can't do it with the L bracket attached. And that's kind of a disadvantage of this one. But it does have a nice Wi-Fi app where if you can run your camera off an app they have. And so you wouldn't necessarily need the intervalometer with this one. You could run everything off the Wi-Fi app. But that's just sort of, again, this is meant to be just sort of an overview of these. Here's where you go as you go up in price. I saw that before we got started that John Sadler had one of these set up with a nice scope. And did you want to talk about that one at all while we're on the topic?
Oh, sure, if you want.
Yeah.
You know, I actually have the original Star Adventurer, not the 2i. So I do not have the Wi-Fi in mine, but otherwise it's basically the same unit. It's so, you know, it has, you know, the polar scope right here. And as Jim said, that the cover is right here for it. So you kind of have to take the deck bracket off if you want to put the illuminator in. There is a pass through in the deck bracket so you can see through it. So if you don't want to illuminate it, you could still do polar alignment probably. But I'm going to end up just getting a pole master adapter and putting it right here, and I'll never use the polar scope ever again on it. So so it's a good little mount. I think Steve Christensen has a lot more experience with his. He has one as well, don't you, Steve? So yeah, it's a good mount. I like it. You know, the scope, obviously, that's really beyond the beginner level as far as price range, I would think, because that's from here up, that's $1,000 worth of stuff. So so I don't know that, you know, most people would put just DSLR right here, you know, and call it a day, DSLR and lenses. but when you can, go into something a little more advanced with it, obviously, because it's a good robust little mount. The tripod, it's compatible with good tripods and everything. I've got an Ioptron tripod underneath it right now. So, but yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. This is, it's been a good value for me.
Thanks, John. Let's see. I hope I have the name right. Naveen, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. That is right. I've got questions around the scopes. Just if you could quickly run through like polar scope versus illuminated scope, and just hit on the challenges with the 2i Pro and mounting the polar scope. Thank you.
Yeah. So with this one, maybe I can stop sharing and kind of show it a little bigger here. So you have an illuminated scope here. So you take this off, you look through there, it lights up. There's a light up reticle. We can then see just where Polaris is using an app. So you get an app to show you where Polaris should be for that time of day and that day on the calendar, and you line it up exactly in there, and then you can put the cap back on and you're good to go. With this one, if I'm using it with the declination bracket attached, I can do that with the camera already on there. With the Star Adventurer, you have to take that bracket off to do it. And there's a little screw-in piece that goes on essentially right here that you then use as your light up reticle.
There's the piece right here.
Yeah. Yep.
It pops into this hole. Oh, let me see. I don't know if you can see it. So right here is where the polar scope opening is. So I'd have to take that off to put this in here if I want to illuminate the polar scope that's in it. If it's, if you don't want to do that, obviously, you won't be able to polar line it as easily, because you won't be able to see the numbers or the dial, because it's not illuminated. So
I heard that there was an update to that for the Skywatcher to eliminate that problem. I think the recent versions has the adapter does allow you to do polar alignment with the declination bracket. I'm not sure. I kind of read somewhere, so I don't know if it's just that recently.
That'd be a big help. So that'd be good if they've got that. They really made good improvements.
Yeah, it's possible that this deck bracket has a wider opening now to allow this piece to fit in with it attached. That would be my guess, because I do know there is a black version of this bracket out there for the Star Adventurer, and maybe that one is a wider opening that would allow this illuminator to go in.
What's the use of the Wi-Fi connection to your camera if you want to be out in the field taking shots?
So the Star Adventurer has its own Wi-Fi signal on it, and so you attach your camera phone to its Wi-Fi network, and then it'll then have a cable that goes to your camera, so you can run both the Star Adventurer and your camera off the Wi-Fi app.
Yeah, the original version, I can still tether the phone to, or a camera to the mount, but it only has like a pre-programmed do an exposure for 10, every so often kind of mode. You can tweak that with an advanced firmware, which is real complicated. No, I'm not bothering with it since I'm using a dedicated astronomy camera with it now. And to your point earlier, I just used an intervalometer with my Canon cameras. So.
All right. Did that answer your question, everyone? All right. You want to pick up sharing, Jim?
Yeah. Where'd my PowerPoint go? There it is. Okay. We still have a lot to cover, so I'm going to keep going here, but I did want to add that if I had this to do over again, I don't know if I would have just started with a star tracker and then done what John did with adding a nicer scope and a nicer camera, or if I would have gone the way I would with a bigger mount that's more expensive. Having the go-to capability is really nice once you're able to get it to do what you want, being able to go outside and say, all right, go find this object and center on it and start taking images and then walk back inside. That's a pretty nice feeling. So there's sort of trade-offs. I'm going to skip. I've got a video of setting it up, but I'm going to skip that for now. We can go back. Oh, can't skip it. Won't let me. There we go. We can go back and watch that again later if we need to, but it just shows how quickly it can be set up. Let's talk a little bit about mounts. So if you're ready to really take the plunge and buy a big mount, there's a lot of options out there. And it's going to be the most important piece of equipment you buy when it comes to astrophotography. The price range is all over the place. You can, with most of this hobby, there's no limit to how much you spend, and there's no limit to how much you can learn. It goes up and up to whatever you want to do. But it generally starts at around $1,000. You have to consider your payload capacities, and so there's a wide range of those, starting at about 30 pounds and going up over 100 pounds. A couple of tips when buying a mount. Basically, what you're looking for is a computerized German equatorial mount with a guiding port. But it's good, like I said, it's the most important piece of your astrophotography setup. And the general rule is to buy as much mount as you can afford, so you can avoid upgrading later. At some point, you're going to want to get a different scope. You're going to want more focal length, or something with more aperture, or something that's faster. You would like to avoid having to buy a new mount every time you get a new scope. So if you can buy more mount than you need now, then hopefully it'll serve you well into the future. I came across this quote in Cloudy Nights, and it says, if the cost of the mount didn't hurt, you didn't spend enough. I think when I first started looking, I was like, well, I'll find a mount for about $1,000. Well, I landed up closer to $2,000. I haven't regretted that. It was painful at the time, spending that much more than I was planning on spending. But even now, like, sometimes I think, boy, when I look at some of the upgrades I want to do, I'm not sure my current mount's going to be enough, and I sure would hate to have to buy another mount. But that's probably somewhere in the future. So again, as much mount as you can buy. My setup now is a little bit silly in that I've got a tiny little scope on a big mount, but like I said, it won't take long before I start coming up against a 44-pound payload, because I don't want to get anywhere near that 44 pounds. I'd rather keep it to about 22 pounds. And once you start adding a guide scope and a camera and all the cabling and a bigger scope, you quickly get up there. So here's sort of an overview of mounts. Again, I just kind of stick with some of the more popular beginner mounts. On the lower end, we have the Celestron Advanced EX. I haven't used this mount. I don't know anybody that has, but just sort of looking through Cloudy Nights, people seem pretty happy with it. I didn't see a whole lot of complaints about it. It gets you in for $900. It'll hold up to 30 pounds, which is, again, big enough for my imaging terrain. As you go up in price, you get better and better motors. So this sort of has the basic DC servo motor. What do you get with a better motor? Well, you get smoother travel and better tracking of the night sky, which leads to better images. So this sort of starts off with a basic motor. You'll see that some have gears and some have belts. Belts, from my understanding, will give you a smoother run and will have less wear. The gears will, over time, begin to wear, and that'll give you more error in your tracking and your guiding. And you'll have, again, your images won't be as nice because you're now not getting as good at tracking along with the night sky. You see, these mounts are not lightweight. On the low end, they start off at 35 pounds, and as you go into the higher end, you get over 100 pounds. And even the one that I've got, which is similar to that Orion Atlas there in that third column, at 54 pounds, it's a bit to put that together. It's not as easy as the star trackers, and I certainly can't carry it in a backpack like I can with the star tracker. Software interface is something to consider. I'm no expert on this. I know that EQ Mod is open source. It's ubiquitous. You'll find that it'll work with a lot of things. From what I could read, Next Remote still has a lot of things that you can do with it, but it may not be as flexible as what you can do with something that uses EQ Mod. You'll see they have different ports on them. Most of them have that hand controller port, which is that RS-232. They'll have an auto guider port, so you can put a guide camera on there. You'll have a USB, so you can attach it to your laptop or other computer. As you get to the high end of the price range, so if you happened to buy a lot of GameStop stock last week and you can afford one of these, you find that you get some additional features. So you have the USB right on the mount. It comes with a built-in USB hub, so you can plug your cameras right into that, and it has some additional power ports. It also does your cable management for you, so you don't end up with a bunch of cables hanging off it. So as you go up in price, you get some nicer features like that. You get a better motor, dual belt drives, and a whole lot more weight to lug around. But with that big capacity, you can put just about any scope on this. So that's sort of give you an overview. I don't know if anybody else wants to make any comments about some of the different mounts out there and some of the different things you want to think about when looking at a mount.
Hey, Jim, I got one question, and I'll just make a quick comment, and then Michael, I'll get to your question. I'd pretty much agree with your overview. I would say the belt, I'm not sure that the wear is so much an issue, but one thing the belt will do is generally make it quieter.
Okay.
When it's running. I put I added a belt mod to my Sirius, for example, and it's much quieter. It tracks a little better, but the other thing is Ioptron does have a CEM line of mounts that kind of parallel these Skywatcher mounts that are worth looking at. The CEM 60 is probably one of the best known of those, but they also have a 40 and a 26 they just announced. So there are lots of options here. I would agree with Jim. EQ mod is pretty nice. Of these mounts, I would probably say the Sirius or the Atlas are as close to a no-brainer as you can get. I would avoid the AVX at all costs unless money is an issue. It simply is not going to perform as well as a Sirius. It has some mechanical deficiencies in how they designed some aspects of it that I don't get into now. But before you buy one of those, I would talk to some people who own them to learn about those. Let's see. Let me let Michael go ahead and ask his question.
Yeah, actually a question and a comment. I'll go with the comment first. On the Celestron, the Next remote definitely is very, very old software as far as an interface. They do have a new one called CPWI, which is actually much, much better and adds additional functionality. The question I had was really more, again, about belts and gears. And I'm assuming that at least with a belt drive, that's a whole lot easier to replace if something should go wrong. Is that a correct statement?
I don't know. Not many people have had to replace them. I have seen people, mostly with what's that Celestron mount? Their bigger one, CX or D. I can't remember.
Yeah,
it came out with one that was belt driven, and people are having problems and having to replace those. The main thing on my mount, again, this is a little more details, but every mount has a motor and then generally some gearbox that then drives the main gear on the mount, because you got to really step it down. And sometimes that last gear that goes between that gearbox and the worm gear, that engagement between those gears can have a periodicity that's usually 10 to 20 seconds. It's really hard to guide out. And if you use a belt that is tightened properly, you can get rid of some of that low level periodic error. But I would not buy a mount whether or not it was belt or gear. I think someone told people that high-end mounts used belts, so all the low-end mounts are putting belts on there to try to look like they're high-end mounts. But people use gears for decades, and I don't know that there was ever a problem. I think most of these mounts will outlive us if you take care of them, so I wouldn't worry about that too much.
thanks.
I'll interject on the gear. I did ask a question because it seems to me like you would get slippage over time with a belt.
Were there teeth on the belt?
Oh, there are. Okay.
They're like on a 3D printer, kind of GT2 style, but bigger belt.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But the comment I was going to make on the geared mount is that if you do buy a geared mount, you want to look at the number of teeth on the gear, because that was actually going to just point to your accuracy in pointing. So if you have fewer teeth on the gear, then you have less. You're not going to get as great an accuracy. So you're not going to get. Maybe you might not get arc second pointing accuracy. So just depending on how many teeth are on the gear. So you do want to, I do know that with Meade, which is my scope, that was an issue. So people bought, like, say, for instance, like the cheaper, I think LX50 it was, but all of a sudden found out, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't have nearly the pointing accuracy as, say, the LX200 or something like that, which had a lot more teeth on the gear. So that the number of teeth, and of course, the worm gear interfacing with those teeth, that actually will give you greater accuracy. Now, you're right in terms of the latency and periodic error that there is that comes with that, but that's something that you can always program out.
Yeah, I think all of these mounts here, I know for the Sirius and the Atlas, a single step of that stepper is 1/8 of an arc second. So I think modern mounts generally, that's a good point, but I think any of the mounts we're talking about here, hopefully that's not a problem. These are, well, other than the AVX, the one on the left, and I don't know much about the EQ8R. Not many people own that one. It's the Skywatcher high-end mount, but the middle two are proven. If you go on Astrobin and search, you'll see tons of images with that. Let me go to John. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, it's
Comment.
more of a little bit of comment and question.
Sure.
In particular, it's with the Orion Sirius Skywatcher HEQ5. There's actually two variants of that. There's the Sirius and the Sirius Pro. They are different mounts, so they're in the same class. I have the Sirius Pro, and I think it's a great mount. And to your comment about the Ioptron, I also have an Ioptron ZEQ25 that I have upgraded to a CEM25. Now the CEM26 is essentially a redesigned CEM25 with whatever improvements they wanted to put on it. I think that's a good mount as well, based on the history of Ioptron. And it's probably, if I remember correctly, the CEM25 is probably about the same price as the advanced AVX, the Celestron AVX. It's less than the Sirius. So, and it does have that, it has a 26-pound payload, I think, instead of a 30-pound payload. But, and the only other comment I wanted to make is with regard to EQ mod, with discussions with Shoestring Astronomy, if I remember correctly, EQ mod only works with SynScan mounts. If they have SynScan controller, that's what EQ mod works with. Just FYI, in case you were wanting to know. That's it.
Thank you. Richard, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I just want to get some comments about the Advanced VX. I've had the Advanced VX mount for, I guess, 3 or 4 years. I've had issues with it. In fact, I sent it off to California to get the gears replaced on it. And with PhD2, I've been able to get 4-minute subs, but it's been a struggle. So I think I would recommend what everybody else is saying is stay away from that and buy something a little heavier and a little more professional grade mount.
Thank you. Yeah. Now the AVX for visual, we're talking about for imaging. For visual,
Yeah.
I've heard it's a wonderful mount because the demands of visual astronomy are a little less stringent. So we're solely talking about long exposure imaging. If you wanted to do EAA, I bet it would also work as a good mount. So just to make that explicitly clear that we're talking about long exposure imaging. Jim, that was a long sideway there. You want to take over again?
That was very helpful, though, so I appreciate that. Thanks, everybody. The other thing I want to say, which probably isn't going to be obvious to most beginners, is that this Orion Sirius and the Skywatcher mounts, there's a company, I think it's Cinta, and I think it's out of China, and they make these mounts and then they get sold by these two different companies. So the big difference you'll see in appearance is that the Skywatchers are white and the Orions are black. From what I've been able to read about them, it seems like Skywatcher has a little bit better warranty and customer support. I know their warranty is transferable if you sell it, whereas the Orion is not. So if you can get the Skywatcher version, it seems like you might be a little bit better off than with the Orion version. Although right now, with supply being low and demand being high, you're probably just going to have to get whichever version you can find. All right, so now we're going to move into scope selection. This doesn't get any easier. I'm just going to talk about wide field apochromatic refractors because I think that's really all a beginner should be thinking about. I think one of the things that I really did right was I went with wide field and a refractor. I think people that try to do something with longer focal lengths or with reflectors or Schmidt-Cassegrains, I think it adds a level of difficulty. It's going to make your learning curve a lot harder, and it's just going to add a lot more frustration. So I think from price standpoint and from ease of use and reward, I would definitely go with a wide field refractor. They're lightweight, they're portable, they're relatively easy to focus. You don't have to do collimation regularly like you do with the other scopes. You have less condensation and dew issues. I was about 6 months in before I finally got a dew heater, and I somehow got away with that. I'm not running into dew issues. I feel like I got a little bit lucky. I probably shouldn't have tried to go that long without getting one, but I had spent all my money at that time, and I had to kind of wait to get the dew heater. I don't think I would have gotten away with that with other scopes. You don't have to leave them outside a long time to get them used to the temperature. A lot of them do require to have a field flattener or reducer, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, here's just sort of an overview to give you what you get for the different price range and what features to look for or avoid. You can see that the price range, it goes up much higher than this, and you can get some that are cheaper than this. The big thing you want to consider is your aperture. You're trying to collect photons from a very distant object that's very faint. It may be a lot of these targets, these deep sky objects are not all that small. You know, they're comparable to the full moon in size, but they're very faint. So you need to have a big aperture so you can collect as many photons as possible. Focal ratios, smaller focal ratios means that you can image a little bit faster. And then you look at your focal length, and that's how much magnification you're going to get. There's different focuser styles. You're going to want to be able to get really good focus. The Mead that I use has a rack and pinion, and it has a fine focus knob. I'm able to get perfect focus every time with that. The helical focusers, like on the Red Cat, you have to twist them. They're a little bit harder to get it fine-tuned to just where you want it, and a little bit more prone to slippage, I think. With my Mead, I can lock it in place once I've got it. And I'm 2 years in. I haven't purchased a automatic focuser yet, and I've been able to get away with that. It holds focus. It doesn't change during the night, even if temperature changes. So somehow I've been able to get away without having to adjust focus on it. So it's been good from a focus standpoint. A lot of these do require that you have a flattener, or as you get to the corners of your image, you're going to have some spherical aberration effects. So you need to put a flattener on them, and then sometimes with a reducer, which will make your field a little bit bigger if you're using a full frame sensor. When I got mine, the reason I chose this Mead 70mm quad, I had made so many decisions that when it came down to not having to get a flattener reducer, that's what sold me. I didn't want to deal with choosing one more piece of equipment. I was done. So I got the quad, which just has that extra piece built into it. So it gives you a flat field. And then the last thing is the image circle size. It's just something to consider with the size of your sensor. I knew I was starting with a full frame DSLR, which has a sensor, I think it's 38mm in diagonal. So I need a pretty big circle. And the closer you get to the edges of that circle, the more vignetting you get and the more spherical aberration you're going to have. And so I was sort of pushing it with a full frame and a 42mm imaging circle. I usually have to discard the outer edges of my picture, but I still get a pretty nice wide field of view with that. Anybody else want to chime in about other considerations about choosing a scope?
I'd say let's keep things moving here. I think that's a good reference. I'm sure if you've not looked at this stuff before, these charts are a little overwhelming now, and there's probably some things that you're not sure about, like focal ratio, but just take in this information, and then, at the end, and also on our imaging list, online, you can ask questions about this, and we can try to help you understand it. So why don't you just keep going, Jim?
Okay. All right, now we have to be able to take a picture in cameras. I'm not an expert in cameras, so I'll just kind of tell you what I know. There's a wide range of options and prices. There's not one camera that's going to be the best choice for everybody. There's a couple of different strategies. Some people will say start off with a mono camera and just start with that. You're going to land up there anyway. So get into filters, get a cooled mono camera, and just start at the beginning of that. And that's one strategy. My strategy has been to go with just an unmodified DSLR and take that as far as I can. And once I'm find that I can't do anything in addition with that, then I'm going to move up to another level, and I'll be able to kind of image all over again. And so that's, in the meantime, I've learned how to do image processing, and I'll be better when I have a better camera. So it's all sort of up to personal preference, what you end up going with. On the plus side for DSLRs, they're versatile. If you buy a DSLR for imaging, you'll find you'll get other uses out of it as well, unless you get a modified one where they remove the IR cut filter so you can get the hydrogen alpha. That'll improve your astrophotography. It's going to make all your daytime images look kind of pinkish. So that's another thing to consider. The reason that you want to have a cooled camera is that as these sensors get warm, they get more noise. What you're trying to do is maximize signal over noise. And so the more you can do to knock off some of the noise that you get from your sensor, the more signal you can pull out, and the better your images are going to be. And cooling has a pretty dramatic effect on that. So if you have a DSLR and you're trying to image in the summertime, that added ambient temperature is going to make a big difference in the amount of noise you get from your camera. Again, this is sort of an overview of the cameras. On the left side, I put a couple of DSLRs. I just went with Canon. I'm familiar with Canon, but from everything I've seen, everything I read, if you use Nikon and use similar cameras from Nikon, you would get pretty much equal results. Same thing, Sony's got some really good cameras that you can get in the DSLR. Look at these two price ranges. For the DSLR, I kind of compared sort of on the low end. I went back a model or two to the Rebel T7. There's really no reason why you would need the latest DSLR. So if you're in the market to buy a DSLR, then you could get one that's a model or two generations back and save some money and still have everything you need. Things to consider, again, are sensor size. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But on these, like on this Rebel, you get an APS-C sensor, which is a little bit smaller than you get on the high-end mirrorless RA camera, which is a DSLR meant for astrophotography with a full frame. So it's got a bigger sensor. A little bit about this ADC, which is just analog to digital conversion. It basically how many levels of gray you get. And so this is 2 to the 14th power. So the higher this number, sort of the more dynamic range you can pull out from each pixel. The unmodified cameras, you won't get hydrogen alpha. So if you're trying to do some emission nebula, you're going to struggle with a DSLR that's unmodified. So what I've done for 2 years, I could certainly do a lot better with a modified camera, but I can pick up some, and it's enough to make it fun for me right now. Again, and I'll get to do it all over again someday when I move up to something that picks up hydrogen alpha. I'm not going to get too much into ISO ranges other than I generally, for my DSLR, I'm usually at 1600 or 3200. And so all of those cameras are going to have that range. Pixel size, I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but basically with long focal lengths, you want a bigger pixel size. With shorter focal lengths, you want a smaller pixel size. And then whether or not you have cooling, and then color or monochrome. With color, there's a colored lens over each of the pixels. And so they're only being used for certain wavelengths. Whereas with a mono camera, each pixel or on the sensor is able to pick up every wavelength. And so you essentially get more resolution and more photon camera gathering capability with a mono camera, and then you can use different filters with it. So when you get a mono camera, you have to factor in that you're also going to buy a set of filters and either a filter drawer or a filter wheel to use them. I put some estimates for filters here. There's a range. You probably could start off at $300, and you probably could easily get in over $1,000 for filters. But if you're using a camera that has a 4/3 sensor, which is smaller than the APS-C and quite a bit smaller than a full frame, you can get away with smaller filters. But if you move up to the ZWO ASI 6200, which has a full frame sensor, you're going to have to use 2-inch filters, which are going to cost quite a bit more than the 1 or 1 1/4 inch filters you can use on a smaller sensor.
Jim, is that for LRGB only?
I think that includes hydrogen alpha and all the narrowband.
Oh, okay. Wow, those are some cheap 2-inch filters. All right. Because I was gonna say one good 2-inch filter narrowband for that camera is at least 1,500 to 2K probably. So
yeah, I just kind of went with what the set they had online. But yeah, I think it would quickly go up much more than that. If you really were spending $4,000 on a camera, you got to be ready to spend a couple thousand more for the filters.
well, the other consideration, like you said before, is if you get a full frame camera, you're gonna have to spend a ton of money on a full frame telescope to feed it images. So that's another consideration. But yeah.
Big enough imaging circle to be able to use all of that sensor.
Yep.
And so on the right side, I've got sort of the range from ZWO, which is a popular astrophotography brand with a lot of different cameras out there. And so we're looking at the cooled cameras because we want to get rid of noise. There's a lot of these versions come in both color and mono versions. If you see MC, that's color. If you see MM, that's going to be their mono version. They have different sensors with different pixel sizes. And again, we'll talk a little bit about pixel size in these next couple of slides. So first, you've got a camera and a telescope. How do you decide what you want to get? My recommendation is go to Stellarium. It's a free program. You go to that website, stellarium.org. You can download this program. It allows you to, it has some cameras and telescopes built in, but you can enter in your own. And so you can enter in all the specifications of the cameras and the telescopes you're looking at. And then you can look at different objects and see, well, what kind of field of view do I get? Is this what I want to, is this what I'm trying to shoot? Is this going to, field of view going to satisfy what I'm trying to do? And it's no accident that the scope I chose in the full frame just happens to capture Andromeda without having to stitch multiple images together. I mean, part of my scope choice was I knew what size camera sensor I had, so I tried different scopes and said 350 millimeters right where I want to be. The other website where you can do this is telescopius.com. They have a telescope simulator where you can sort of play around with that. Let's see, the Stellarium. Let's see if I can show you that. Astronomy tools. And so the way that this Telescopius website works, so you can look at different cameras. So here's Andromeda. If I go in there and I say, all right, that's my current camera. What would it look like if I got a ZWO 1600 and used my current scope? And so this is with a 4/3 sensor. And so it just shows you that it gets you a more cropped view. And so you can play around with different scopes. You can change your focal length and see what it looks like. And you can match that with cameras. And you can get an idea of just what scope and camera combination you want to get. And there's another consideration in all this. Which is pixel size. There's Telescopius. And so basically you want to match your pixel size to your scope. So you've got the appropriate pixels to match the image that your scope is producing. I wouldn't get too carried away with getting this match exactly right, but you also don't want to end up too far out of whack. And so this is a suitability calculator from Astronomy Tools. So you got the website down there in the bottom. You can go down there and you can kind of see where it lines up. This is my scope is a 350 millimeter focal length. There isn't any reducer. My camera does, we won't get into bidding, but it does 1:1, and that's my pixel size. Now, ideally, your resolution is around 1 to 2, I believe that's arc seconds. This comes out to 3. And so then this down here tells me that with this combination, I'm getting undersampling. So it reduces guiding errors, which is good, and improves signal to noise at the expense of finest details. So with my combination, and Michael, someone else can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's why my stars come out a little fuzzier looking. They're a little bit more bloated. I don't quite get all that fine detail. If I had a better ratio that's closer to 1 to 2, then I might get a little bit better fine detail on my images than I do at 3. We don't have the best seeing in this part of the country, so you probably can get away with a little bit higher than if you try to get too small. Seeing errors are going to outweigh any difference you've got in pixel size. So I probably lost some of you on that, but just know that that's another factor to consider.
Yeah, I would agree with you. If you're doing wide field, you can definitely not worry about this as much. All it means is if you pixel peep and zoom way in at 800 power, you might notice things a little fuzzier. But if you're trying to shoot M31 and see the whole galaxy at once and make it your background, you'll never notice the difference between 2 and 3 arc seconds a pixel. If you're trying to shoot really tiny objects or do planetary imaging of the planets, then this really rears its head. But I would agree, if you're doing a little refractor, I wouldn't worry too much about this.
All right, so now you've got your mount, you got your camera, you've got your scope, but you still have to make it all work. And so I just want to kind of go over some of the other things that you need. You have to have some way to power it. I didn't know this till my mount arrived. I'm like, oh, I need a 12-volt power supply, and it has to be DC. I think my first thing I tried to do was to get an adapter, and that didn't provide enough amperage. So I then went with a marine battery in a case, which is nice because it's portable, but it's heavy. So that was my original start. And what was nice about that is I could go down to Batteries Plus and I could buy that day. And I was wanting to get started. So I just bought the case and the battery at Batteries Plus, and I was good to go for, I think, just over $100. What I've done since then is I've added Pegasus Astro Power Box, which allows me to plug into AC power, and it has dew heater controllers where it measures the temperature and the humidity and turns my dew heaters on when they need to be on, and I don't even have to worry about it. As long as they're plugged in, it's doing its job. It has an adapter where it supplies power to my DSLR, so I don't have to worry about the batteries dying. It powers my mount, and I basically just have to plug it in. The downside of it is I think it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $300, but it does make setup a lot easier, and it takes a lot less having to set up, making sure I've got enough charge in my battery, and that my camera is not going to run out of battery power. Another thing that you have to have is if you're using a DSLR, you have to have a camera adapter, and that depends a little bit on your telescope. You have to get the right one for your brand of camera, and then you have to get the right size for your scope. They only come in a couple different sizes. I think they're 42 and 48 are the typical sizes. You have to make sure you get the one for your make camera. They're not too expensive, but it's something you need to have. You need to have a way to focus. And so, let's see the about enough mask over here. And so that's something you put on the end of your scope. It gives you a little cross with a line through it. When you get the line right through the middle, you know that you're in perfect focus. And you then remove it and start your imaging. If you look at the Red Cat scopes, they've got one built into the lens cap, so you don't have to buy a separate one, but most of them you have to buy a separate one, or you have to get someone to 3D print one for you. Out on the web, there are all the dimensions you need for 3D printing, and if you can find a local 3D printer, you can get one printed, or you can buy one like this one I got on Amazon. It wasn't very expensive, and it fits a variety of size scopes because it has a little adjustment screws on there. Those are the things that you really need to get started. Now, as you start getting more into this, you're going to want to add a few more things. So eventually you're going to want to add a guide scope. I think most people use the ZWO ASI 290 mini camera to go with that. It's just a mono camera. It's not very expensive, but it does what you need to do for guiding, which is it with the use of PhD2 software, it finds a star and it keeps your mount pointed in the right direction, your scope pointed in the right direction. Mentioned dew heaters and a controller. I got away without having those for about 6 months. My favorite addition that I did in the beginning, I used the hand controller on the mount, and that's how I find my targets. But when I finally figured out how to set up a laptop and put some software on there, like Sequence Generator Pro, and I could just tell it, go to this target and center on it and start taking pictures, my life got a lot easier. So having a laptop is definitely something you want to add. Some people use a mini computer, which is basically a small motherboard with a little bit of memory and a Wi-Fi controller and no screen. So you have to basically log into it from a screen inside your house or from a laptop. But then you can just attach that to your mount and that can run all that. And if you're using ZWO cameras, you can also look into getting an ASI Air. And this is about as close to plug and play as you're going to get, where it'll run your cameras, it'll run the guiding on your mount. It basically has PhD2 built into it, but you end up using their software on your pad or your phone, and you can then control everything using your tablet or your phone. Other things to consider, I suppose one of these days I'll break down and buy an electronic focuser. That's a good thing to have, especially when you get into filter wheels and you're changing filters in the night, and that's going to change your focus a little bit. And then just filters in general. There are filters you can use even when you're doing color. I can't say too much about them because I haven't started using filters yet, but I know it's in my future. And then you'll need a way that either you have a drawer that the filters fit into the imaging train, or you have a wheel that rotates them around automatically for you. I think that pretty much covers it. Let's see if I can skip this because you don't need to watch me set up here. Just these are some of the things that I've taken. Some of these were taken right in Raleigh using the Meade quad in the Sirius Atlas Pro. Just give you an idea of images that you can take. And then I think we can go to questions and other comments that people want to make.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. That was comprehensive and a good start, I bet, for everyone. Let me go to some questions we have from the chat. One person here says they have a Canon DSLR. They have a 200 millimeter and 400 millimeter lens, and they're interested in the tracking mounts on your first screen. And basically, I said the 200 would probably work. The 400 might be challenging. You have any comments on that?
Yeah, I love my 200 millimeter lens. I've got a 200 millimeter that I use on my Canon DSLR on the Star Tracker, and that is probably my favorite combo. I haven't tried to push it further. I know that people have even used that Tamron 600 millimeter with the Ioptron Sky Guider and have gotten pictures of galaxies. I think just as you go up in focal length, the sensitivity to guiding, you're not going to be able to do as long exposures and you're collecting less light at the same time. I think the complexity goes up quickly when you start getting to 400 millimeters. But at 200 millimeters, it's fantastic, especially if you're in a dark sky.
Yeah, that would be my thought, is that when you go beyond 200, you might get it to work, but you're really starting to get into, I mean, 400 millimeters is essentially starting to be a small telescope, and you might need to look at that next level of mount. Someone quickly, so that M42, if you'll go back one screen, I think that you had taken. Yeah, did you take that in Raleigh?
No, so a lot of these were taken dark skies. That one was taken up in Virginia, and that's about World 4. I don't know if I've got one of those that I took in Raleigh. The whirlpool underneath it I took in Raleigh. I've done the Pleiades there in Raleigh, but just the speed at which I can image in World 4 versus the Bortle 7 or 8 that I have at my house in Raleigh, it's just hard to justify all the hours I spent. It took me about 6 hours of imaging to get a decent image of Andromeda using my camera here in Raleigh. I took it up to a place in Virginia with that Bortle 4, and basically in 10 minutes I got the same image that it took me 6 hours in Raleigh. So you can do a lot more with an unmodified camera in a dark sky, which again, if you're traveling and you've got a little star tracker, that's a kind of a great way to go with an unmodified camera. Otherwise, you're probably going to want something that can pick up hydrogen alpha, so you can do emission and narrowband imaging, which is much more capable of doing that under these bright skies in Raleigh.
Yeah, I would say for most of us, a good night at a dark site like you're talking about is worth at least 5 to 7 nights of data from your house where you're light polluted. So if you're looking at a color camera, that is a consideration. And I'll just say that's why most of us bought a monochrome camera, because we use a different type of filter for nebula imaging that pretty much negates light pollution, but it is an additional expense and takes a little more time. So a lot of people do opt for color, and just understand there are targets you can do even in light pollution. But let's see. So Robert asked about oversampling versus undersampling. We can maybe talk about that here. Is this briefly, you want to talk about that, or?
I don't know how much I can say about it more than what I've already said. It's not a concept that I've got that good of a grasp on.
So it has to do with pixel size. And basically what you're asking is how much of the sky does each pixel in your camera see? And you could think if you're shooting something like Mars, which is tiny, and each pixel was equivalent to 1/4 of the size of Mars, that you're not going to pick up any detail. Versus if you have tiny pixels, then you can start to pick up details. And you would think something like Hubble telescope can have really tiny pixels because there's no atmosphere. But since we have an atmosphere that we have to shoot through, there is a limit to how much benefit you get from getting tiny pixels. At some point, you're just getting more pixels version of a very blurry image due to the atmosphere. So generally, if you're shooting wide fields like this, like for example, this nebula, the M42 he's showing here, that's probably 3.5 degrees across. So that's, I can't do math anymore. So that's imagine 7 full moons across there. Or if you stretch your arm out, that's about almost the width of your fist. So that's a pretty good size of this region of the sky. Versus this M51 below it, that's probably smaller than the size of the moon in extent. So obviously, when you shoot something like the M51 down there, you probably want to have finer detail than if you're shooting a wider field. So, that's probably almost an entire talk in itself about how to optimize your telescope and sensor together. But generally, if you're starting out, you're probably going to use a camera that you can afford or you already own. And I wouldn't worry too much about getting this stuff figured out perfectly. What you want is a camera that you can use. You want a pretty small scope that's easy to put on a mount, and you want a mount to put it on. And if you get all that working together, you're doing pretty good. And worrying about if you're over or under sampling maybe isn't your primary consideration. So there's a question about CCD versus CMOS. Do you want to talk on that, Eddie, or?
My would be CMOS. I think that's
So CCD, CMOS, I mean, they both, CCD, if you're not familiar with it, is the traditional technology used for astronomical sensors, whether it be professional or amateur. Practically, to get the same size sensor with a CCD, you're probably going to pay 3 to 4 times as much money as for a CMOS sensor. Almost the entire imaging industry has moved to CMOS. And the thing to remember when you're buying these cameras is no one is making sensors. Sony is primarily making the sensors in these ZWO cameras. They do not make sensors for imaging with astronomy. They make sensors for DSLRs, for terrestrial imaging, for security cameras. They don't even probably know much about astronomy. So we're lucky that some of the sensors they make we can repurpose for this imaging hobby of ours. And so there are some areas with you, if you have a very big telescope, the CCD traditionally will have larger pixels, and this whole this thing we're talking about with sampling, it could help you. If I were buying a camera now, I wouldn't even look at the CCD cameras, unless you just want to spend a lot of money. The CMOS cameras are more than, I mean, you can, these images you're seeing here are amazing, and they were taken with a relatively, what do you say, high-end DSLR?
Yeah.
Which is still cheaper than a CCD camera would have cost. So, you know, and you can get a nice one-shot color cooled CMOS camera that has the same kind of sensor as this DSLR for, you know, around $1,200. So I don't really see a reason to go out and spend $4,000 to $5,000 on a CCD sensor in this day and age, unless you have a very specific purpose. For some scientific purposes, CMOS is better understood, like for photometry and very specialized uses. But I wouldn't. I'd be hard pressed to find a reason to buy a CCD camera these days. Anyone else want to add to that? All right. Again, there are some uses for CCD cameras, and if you own a CCD camera, I wouldn't say get rid of it. Obviously, they were good cameras. It's just if you're buying from scratch, the CMOS is just a better price performance these days. Dave
Mike,
asked, oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I was going to pipe in about CCD versus CMOS, and my only experience comes from obviously the EAA side of things. I noticed that my experience, the CCDs were much more sensitive. You could acquire, you know, those pictures faster, but they, again, for the price point, you were looking at much smaller sensors and not capable of kind of doing as much as you could for the given price point of a CMOS.
Yeah, I would agree traditionally. Now, the latest round, you know, some of these, like these ASI 2600s, they're at 90+ quantum efficiency and like 1 electron read noise. It's almost the perfect sensor now. So they're perfecting CMOS. But yeah, it's a thing that's kind of in transition. You know, the market has been switching the last few years. Most of the companies that make CCDs are going to stop making them, so it won't even be a choice for much longer. So Dave asked about the Zoe ASI Air Pro. I don't know if Arjun is still here. Arjun, do you want to talk about that some? I know he's joining us from.
Hi.
Oh, you're here. Okay. What
Hey.
was it, midnight for you or something? But
No, it's not midnight. It's 9. So it's yeah.
so Arjun,
it's actually a clear night here. So I'm actually preparing. So.
I don't want to hold you up too long. Arjun
Okay.
was living in the RTP for a while. He moved back. I'm gonna get the country wrong, but
Netherlands.
So he's joining us from overseas. So thank you.
Yeah.
But
Hey,
you've used
hi.
that device. Could you just give a quick overview?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the ASAR, you know, I did a presentation. It's on YouTube for the club, so you can see the state of it like a couple months ago. So it's a all-in-one little mini computer. It's basically a Raspberry Pi, but it has a 12-volt power distribution built in, plus also a dual heater control. And, you know, I'm actually holding my iPad right now, so that's why the screen's maybe wobbly. You know, you can control it via your phone or your iPad, and so you don't need a laptop, you don't need a computer hookup, and it works in the field, right? So it's a wireless thing. And, you know, it really, you know, I think imaging for me, you know, I started 2 years ago, and at the start with the computer and all the software, PhD and plate solving and all that, it was pretty daunting and complex. And, you know, ASIR really makes it like super simple. You know, it makes it like an Apple, right? You just hook it up plug everything in, and it does polar. It helps you with polar alignment. It helps you with go to, right? You just type in, I want to look at M51, right? And the telescope mount kind of slews to it. But then the cool thing about plate solving is that actually if your mount isn't correctly aligned, or not level or not polar aligned or something, right? With plate solving, it makes a quick picture, and then it figures out where it's actually looking at, and then it sends corrections to the mount to actually kind of center the object immediately in the center of the frame. And you can do that on the PC as well, and it's pretty advanced on the PC. And an ASAR is basically just super easy and built in. So I recommend it, right? For the most advanced things, I think Michael has convinced me to use more complex things. But for my simple kind of grab and go, kind of get a star tracker or something with GoTo basically, and the small telescope and all that, it works wonders. So I would recommend it, as a start as well.
Okay, that's great. We have a follow-up. Someone wanted to know about your AZ GTI mount in equatorial mode.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the interesting thing is, right, so you have the star trackers, and what was mentioned is that they only have one motor, which is basically only RA. So it means that it can only track the rotation of the Earth, but it cannot go to a certain location. So for that you need two motors, right? Also declination motor, so it can also slew to different targets. So there's another cheap mount, which is a bit more complex version of the Star Adventurer, and that's the AZ GTI. So you can put it on a little wedge, and I actually have it standing here, and then it becomes a full go-to thing. So I'm just going to show it. Hold on. If I can flip the camera around. I don't know if I can. How does it work? Maybe not. It probably will make everything go wrong. But maybe you guys can see this.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Yeah.
Hey,
so this
Mach
is
1.
the So this is the mount here, and it's on this wedge, right? So you can align it to the polar star. So you point this one to Polaris, and then you have like a little telescope on there, and actually the ASAR is underneath here. Oh, okay. Oh,
Point it down a
I'm
little.
not watching the screen, so I'm like,
Point it down a little. There you go.
There you go. So this is the little computer that controls the whole thing. And I actually put a autofocus thing as well. So this entire setup fits in a backpack. And the interesting thing is it does go to, right? So I don't have to figure out like like an ancient Egyptian how I have to hop from one asterism constellation to another one to find my target. So it's Zwol is trying to make things easier for people, and it removes some of the functionality maybe, but it does make things a lot easier. Like an Apple phone is easier, right? Or so yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Cheers.
I would agree. If you're using Zoe equipment, it definitely is kind of, they're selling it as an entire package. Is John Stadler still around? He had a question.
Well,
or a comment.
I was just going to ask about that. I was thinking the ASI was pretty limited on the camera side support to ZWO products. Has that changed? Or is it
So for Astro cameras, it's only CWO cameras, right? But they do support a pretty wide variety of DSLRs right now. But I think there's a couple of ones missing. But I think if you go to the website, you can find the latest supported things, because everybody's asking for their Canons and the full frame kind of cameras and the new Sonys and all that. So they're constantly adding those, but I think you can't use another Astro camera with the ASI.
Okay, yeah, and that's what I thought, because I know some people may have QHY cameras and they may or may not work with it. If you want an equivalent appliance to that ASI Air without the power distribution, you'd probably have to look at the StellarMate appliance instead, which is purely open as far as the drivers it supports. So it's a similar form factor, similar concept, just it's made by a different group.
Right. Now, I will try to draw this back sort of to the beginner context. As Jim said earlier, if you get a tracker and you have a DSLR and you own a camera lens already, you can just take that setup, put it outside, point it at a constellation like Orion, and just have it start taking 20, 30-second exposures for 20, 30 minutes and get a pretty nice image. So adding something like an ASI Air or a laptop with software control is something you do later just as a convenience. For example, most of us put our telescopes outside, come inside, control them remotely, and let the software take all the pictures for us while we're sleeping. That's kind of the end game. You don't have to start there by any stretch. You can get some really great results just simplifying things. And so just understand those are options, but you don't have to go that deep to get started. Any other questions?
I do have a question for Arjan.
Thank you,
In
Jordan.
your image, you do have the ASI Air Pro connected to the GTI, right? How does that work overall? Because that's the only one that's available right now. B&H has the GTI available, and I just made an order for the ASI Air Pro used, but it hasn't arrived yet. But I'm just thinking, how does that work for you?
So I got a cable to connect them, but you can also just use Wi-Fi, so it's all wireless, and people seem to have good experiences with those. So that's probably the easiest, and you don't have something that can get tangled up either. So.
Thanks.
And there's explanations out there to just figure it out. Like you have to do some Wi-Fi trickery, but it's actually nice wireless. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions? Arjun probably started doing this about a year ago, and he did what I did when I started about 18 years ago. Is you end up with one of everything, and then you figure out what you like. All right. Well, if we are out of comments and questions, I want to thank Jim and everyone else who contributed today. And we'll just say goodbye today. So thanks again, and have a good evening.
Yep. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.